crowbar bit into rotted padlock wood. The old door split with a crack that echoed across the cove. A pair of loons lifted off the water and screamed into the morning fog. An eviction notice fluttered to the porch behind her, pinned by a small gray stone. Her hands shook. Not from cold. From 41 years of being told this one door was off limits. She pried again. The hasp tore free and clattered onto the boards. Inside, the dark smelled of pine resin, machine oil, and something sweeter underneath. Like rose water. She stepped in. The floor groaned. A shape rose under a canvas tarp, long and curved, the color of cherry wood under dust. Beside it sat a steel case wrapped in a chain. Her name was Margaret Hollis. She was 78 years old. What was a dead husband still hiding from her? Stay with me on this one. The eviction notice had arrived 9 days earlier. A young man in a clean blue tie taped it to the front door and left without knocking. Margaret found it after breakfast. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the porch swing with the paper in her lap and watched the lake until the coffee in her cup went cold. The cottage had been Walter's grandfather's place. Walter had brought her to Pinecrest, Maine, on their honeymoon in 1982. He had told her that morning, looking out at the cove, that he would never let go of this house. He kept that promise for 41 years. Then he had a stroke in the kitchen, between the toaster and the sink, and he never said another word to her. The paramedics had said it was quick. The doctor in Bangor had said it was painless. Margaret had not asked either of them how they would know. That was 2 years ago. The bills had not stopped. The taxes had not stopped. The roof had started to lift on one corner during a winter storm, and the propane company had begun to call her by her first name in a way that felt less friendly each month. Walter had been a careful man. That was the word neighbors used. Careful. He balanced his checkbook on Sunday nights with a green pen. He kept his work boots lined up by the door, toes pointed out ready. He read the paper from the front page to the back without skipping the obituaries. He told her once in a low voice that a man who skipped the obituaries was a man who thought he was special. He had not seemed special. He had seemed dependable. He had worked 31 years at the paper mill in Millinocket, then taken a quiet job repairing outboard motors for the marina on the south side of the lake. He had liked his coffee black. He had liked his radio on low. He had liked his boathouse locked. Margaret had only ever stood at the boathouse door twice. Once in the first year of their marriage, when she had carried him a lemonade in a mason jar, and he had taken the jar at the threshold with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The second time was after a hurricane warning, when she had needed a tarp from inside. He had told her to wait on the porch. He had brought the tarp out himself. He had not let her cross the door frame. She had asked why exactly once, on a Tuesday in the summer of 1986. He had set down his fork. He had looked at her the way he looked at a faulty switch on a motor. Then he had said quietly that some things a man needed for himself, and that she should never ask again. She had not asked again. That was the kind of woman she had been. Believe me. She had been raised to keep a clean house, a peaceful table, and a closed mouth. For 41 years she had kept all three. She had ironed his shirts on Sunday afternoons. She had darned his socks by the wood stove in the winter. She had made coffee at 4:30 in the morning when he had the early shift, and again at noon when he came home for lunch, and again at 6 when he sat down with the paper. She had never opened his mail. She had never gone through the pockets of his work pants when she washed them. She had taken what she had been given. She had asked for nothing more. And now, here at the end of all of it, she was being asked to leave the only home she had ever made. By a bank she had never set foot in. Because of a loan she had never seen. Because of a husband she had thought she had known. Now Walter was in the cemetery on the hill behind the white clapboard church. And the bank wanted the cottage by the end of the month. They said Walter had taken a second mortgage in 2017. She had never signed it. She had never seen it. The signatures on the paperwork were not hers, but the bank manager said that did not matter, because Walter had used a power of attorney that she did not remember signing either. The bank manager's name was Daniel Reeve. He was new in town. He had moved up from Portland in the spring. He drove a clean white sedan with rental plates that he had not yet swapped out. People said he was polite and quick with numbers, and that he never quite looked you in the eye for more than a second at a time. He had called Margaret 3 times in the past month. Each call had been gentle. Each call had ended the same way. The bank, he said, was sorry. The bank had no choice. The bank would help her find a small apartment in Bangor where she would be more comfortable. She did not want to be comfortable in Bangor. She wanted to wake up to the sound of water hitting the dock. She wanted to be buried next to Walter on the hill under the white pines. So on the 8th morning, with 1 day left, she walked across the dewy grass to the tool shed. She found Walter's old crowbar where he had left it, leaning in the corner behind the rakes. She wiped the rust off the curve with the corner of her apron. She walked down the path through the ferns to the boathouse he had never let her enter. She stood in front of the padlock for a long time. The lake was glass. The fog had not yet lifted. A heron stepped slowly along the shoreline, lifting one stick leg at a time, watching her. She put the crowbar into the hasp. She closed her eyes. She thought of Walter telling her, quietly, that some things a man needed for himself. Then she pulled. Inside the boathouse, the air was cold and still. Light fell in stripes through the slats, dust drifting in the beams like slow snow. The shape under the tarp was longer than she expected. It nearly filled the whole bay. Margaret set the crowbar down. She took the corner of the tarp in both hands. She pulled, careful as a woman lifting a sheet off a sleeping child. A boat. A wooden boat, cherry red and cream, with chrome cleats and a curved windshield. The wood was waxed. The seats were tucked under fitted covers. A small brass plate near the stern read Chris-Craft Sportsman, 1948. She put her hand on the side of the hull. It was warm where the sun had been touching it through a crack in the slats. It hummed under her palm like it had been waiting to be touched. It looked like a boat from a magazine. It looked like a boat that had been loved. Walter had never owned a boat in their life together. He had never even rented one. He had refused, every summer, to set foot in the marina rentals at the south end of the lake. He had said the water was no place for an honest man. She stepped back. Her foot bumped the steel case. The case was the size of a small footlocker. The chain around it ran to a ring bolted into the floor. She knelt. The padlock on the chain was newer than the one on the door. It had not been touched by rust. She tried the crowbar on the chain. The chain held. She tried it on the bolt in the floor. The bolt held. Then she noticed a small key taped to the underside of the boat's dashboard. Plain brass, no markings. The key turned. The case clicked. She lifted the lid. Letters. A neat stack of letters bound with brown twine. The top envelope was addressed in Walter's slanted handwriting. The name on it was not hers. The name on it was Eleanor. She felt her knees go soft. She sat down on the cold floor. She put the stack on her lap. She untied the twine with fingers that did not feel like her own. The first letter was dated June 1982. The first line was, "My darling Eleanor, I will come for you and the boy as soon as I can." The boy. The boy. The 2 words sat in her chest like swallowed glass. She read 3 more letters before her eyes began to blur. Eleanor was a hospital nurse. The boy was 4 years old in the second letter, 6 in the third, 12 in the fourth. In the second letter, Walter wrote about a piece of land he was saving up for. In the third, he wrote about a small house in Portland with a yard and a school not far from the hospital. In the fourth, he wrote, "My hands are not the hands of a young man anymore, and I am sorry for every year I have made you wait." The letters were never sent. Every envelope was sealed. Every stamp was unstuck. Walter had written them. He had not been able to mail them. He had locked them in a box. He had chained the box to the floor. There was a photograph in the last envelope. A boy of maybe 6 standing on a beach holding a plastic pail. Beside him a tall man in a flannel shirt, kneeling, one hand on the boy's small shoulder. The man was Walter. The boy had Walter's chin. The boy had Walter's narrow shoulders. The boy was smiling the way a boy smiles when he believes the man beside him is going to stay. At the bottom of the case was a waterproof pouch. She unzipped it. Inside were bonds. Bearer bonds. She counted them once, then twice, then a third time because her hands were shaking too much for her to be sure. $186,000. In paper. In a boathouse. In Maine. She sat for a long time with the case open on her lap. The heron outside took flight with a slow whump of wings. Somewhere up the road a screen door slammed. A truck started. The world went on, the way the world always does, no matter what a woman finds in a locked room. She closed the case. She wrapped the tarp back over the boat. She walked up the path to the cottage. She put the kettle on. She poured herself a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table, where Walter had eaten his oatmeal every morning for 41 years. She watched the steam rise. She did not cry yet. The crying would come later. Right then, she just needed to feel the warm cup in her hands. To pretend, for 3 small minutes, that the morning had been ordinary. That the boathouse had been empty. That Walter had been only what he had seemed. The kettle ticked as it cooled. A knock came at the door. Margaret set the cup down. The tea was still too hot to have drunk. Through the kitchen window, she could see the corner of a clean white sedan parked at the end of her gravel drive. The rental plates caught the morning sun. Her hand went, without her telling it to the front of her apron, smoothing it. She crossed the parlor. She opened the front door. Daniel Reeves stood on the porch with a folder under his arm. His tie was the same shade of blue as the eviction notice still pinned beside his elbow under the small gray stone. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. The way a smile had not reached Walter's eyes 41 summers ago, when she had brought lemonade to a door she was not allowed to cross. For a moment she could not breathe. The shape of his jaw. The narrow set of his shoulders. The way his right hand hung a little farther from his body than his left. The way Walter's had hung after the mill accident in '79. He said, "Mrs. Hollis." He said, "May I come in?" He said, "There are a few things we should discuss before tomorrow." She stepped aside. She let him in. She did not yet trust her voice. He sat in Walter's chair. He set the folder on the coffee table. He looked around the room the way a man looks at a room he is measuring. He did not look at her. He looked at the wallpaper. He looked at the wood stove. He looked at the framed photograph on the mantel of Walter standing on the dock in a flannel shirt, holding a lake trout, squinting at the sun. His eyes stayed on the photograph for a long second. He blinked. Then he looked down at his folder. He said, "I am here to offer kindness." Margaret did not sit. She stood by the doorway. The Chris Craft sat under its tarp in the boathouse 50 yards away. The bond sat in the steel case. The letters sat in her apron pocket. The boy who had been 4 years old. The boy who had been 12. The boy who would now be a grown man in a blue tie, in her husband's chair, talking to her about a kindness. She said, "You look like him." His head snapped up. "Just an inch. Just enough." He said, "Like who?" She said, "Like Walter." The silence in the parlor was so deep she could hear the wood stove ticking. He set down the folder. He stood up slowly, the way a man stands when his legs have gone weak. He went to the photograph on the mantel. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He did not say anything. Then quietly, almost to himself, he said, "My mother's name was Alina." The fog had lifted off the lake by then. A loon called somewhere far out toward the islands. A long, lonely falling call. The sound a woman might make if she stood on a dock at dawn and saw a boat going away from her and not coming back. "If you are still with me on this one," hit that subscribe button right now, because what Daniel said in the next 3 minutes turned this whole story upside down. He told her his mother had died in Portland in 2004. Liver cancer. He had been 22. He had been the one to clear out her apartment. He had found a shoebox under her bed. Photographs. A man on a dock, holding a trout squinting at the sun. A man at a boat show in Boston. A man kneeling beside a 4-year-old boy on a beach, both of them grinning at the camera. None of the photographs had names on the back. His mother had never told him the man's name. She had only ever said, when he asked, that his father had been a kind man who could not stay. He had grown up believing his father was a drifter, a man who had come and gone before he could remember. He had become a banker because he had wanted to understand money. He had wanted to understand the kind of money that lets a man go where he wants and come home when he wants. He had wanted, he said, to never be the one left waiting on a dock. He had married a woman from South Portland who worked at the children's hospital. He had 2 small daughters. He sent them to school he could afford. He paid his bills on the first of the month. He kept his work boots lined up by the door. He had not realized, until he said it out loud in Margaret's parlor, how much of his life he had built in the exact shape of a man he had never met. 2 years ago, he had been promoted to a regional position. He had asked for the main corridor. He had told himself it was for the trout streams. He had told himself it was for the small towns. He had told himself a lot of things. Then 6 months ago, a file had crossed his desk. A foreclosure file. Pinecrest. A cottage on the cove. A widow. A second mortgage taken in 2017 by a man named Walter Hollis. He had recognized the name the moment he read it. His mother had written it in the inside cover of her Bible. Walter H. He had taken the file home. He had not slept. He had pulled the deed. He had pulled the tax records. He had pulled the marriage license. He had pulled the death certificate. He had pulled the man's old work records from the paper mill. He had even driven up to Pinecrest in plain clothes on a Saturday and stood in the back of the cemetery on the hill behind the white clapboard church and read the name on the granite stone. Walter Edward Hollis. The middle name was the same as his own middle name. His mother had named him Daniel Edward Reeve. She had never explained the middle name. She had only smiled when he had asked her, the way a woman smiles when she does not want to give a child more than the child can carry. He had not contacted Margaret for a month because he had not known what to do with what he had found. Then he had made a choice. He had moved up the foreclosure timeline. He had pushed the eviction. He had told himself it was a clean way to handle it. The bank takes the cottage. The cottage goes to auction. He buys it through a shell company. The widow gets a small apartment in Bangor and a check. The cottage stays in the bloodline. Nobody has to know. Margaret listened. She did not interrupt. She had spent 41 years not interrupting Walter. She had spent 2 years not interrupting strangers at the door. She knew how to let a man finish a story he had been carrying for a long time. When he was done, she said, "Walter wrote your mother letters. He never mailed them. They are in the boathouse." His face changed. Not in any large way. Just a softening around the jaw. The look of a man who had been bracing for a fight and had been offered a glass of water instead. He said, "May I see them?" She said, "That depends." She sat down in her own chair across from him, with the coffee table between them. She placed Walter's old wedding band on the table, the one she had taken off his finger at the funeral home. She placed beside it the small brass key from under the dashboard. She said, "You wanted a kindness. I will give you one. But it is not the one you came for." She told him she would not fight the foreclosure if it stood on its own merits. She told him it did not. She told him the signatures on the second mortgage were not hers, and that any clerk in any county courthouse could see it within 10 minutes. She told him she had a notarized copy of her real signature from her driver's license renewal in 2015, and that she had taken 3 letters out of the steel case that morning, and dropped them in an envelope at the post office, addressed to her sister in Augusta, with instructions on what to do with them if anything happened to her in the next 9 days. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean forward. She just sat in her parlor and said the words she had practiced quietly in her head for the whole walk back from the boathouse. He listened. His hands lay flat on the folder in his lap. He did not move them. He did not speak. She said, "I do not want your bank. I do not want your shell company. I do not want a check. I want this cottage in my name, free and clear, with the second mortgage erased as a fraud. I want a written letter from your bank stating that no further action will be taken against the property in my lifetime." She paused. The kettle in the kitchen ticked one last time as it gave up the rest of its heat. She said, "And I want you to come into the boathouse with me. I want you to read what your father wrote to your mother. I think you have waited long enough." He looked up at her. His eyes were wet. He did not bother to hide it. He said, "Why are you doing this? You could ruin me. You could ruin the bank. You could take everything." She said, "Because I am too old to be cruel, and too old to be cheap, and too old to teach you anything except by example. I had 41 years with him. You had none. I will not also take the words he left for your mother." She paused. She said, "But I will not be moved out of my own home. Not by you. Not by anyone. Walter built me a porch, and he built me a kitchen, and he built me a swing. He may have built another family in another city. But he did not build them this. This is mine." He bowed his head. Not in defeat. In a way she had not seen in any man since her father, at her own mother's funeral, 58 years before. He nodded once. Twice. He stood up. He left the folder on the chair. He followed her out the front door, down the porch steps, across the dewy grass, down the path through the ferns, to the boathouse where the door already hung open on its broken hinge. He stepped across the threshold. His father had not allowed her to cross for 41 years. She came in behind him. The dust in the beams of light moved aside for him, the way it had moved aside for her. He stood in front of the boat for a long time. He put his hand on the cherry-red side, in the same place she had put hers. He let it stay there. His shoulders shook once, then went still. She opened the steel case. She handed him the stack of letters, tied again with the brown twine, the way Walter had tied them. He held the stack against his chest like a child against a coat in a cold wind. He did not read them in front of her. That was a kindness she gave him without being asked. She walked back up to the cottage. She left the boathouse door open behind her. She put a fresh kettle on the stove. She took down 2 cups from the cabinet instead of 1. She set them on the counter, side by side, the way she had set them out for Walter every morning for 41 years. And for the first time in 2 years, the second cup did not feel like a habit she had forgotten to break. It felt like a place she had finally chosen to keep open. Daniel signed the letter on the bank's letterhead that afternoon, at the kitchen table where Walter had eaten his oatmeal. The second mortgage was retracted by the end of the following week, listed in the bank's internal records as a clerical error that had been caught in routine audit. The deed was filed clean in Margaret's name. The eviction notice came off the porch. The small gray stone went back into the garden bed by the front steps, where it had come from. The bearer bonds Margaret split into 3 equal parts. 1 part she kept for the roof and the propane and the property taxes for as long as she would live in the cottage. 1 part she put in a trust for Daniel's 2 small daughters in Portland, to be opened on their 18th birthdays. The 3rd part she sent, in an envelope without a return address, to the nursing scholarship fund at the hospital in Portland, where a woman named Eleanor had once worked the night shift. The Chris Graft she did not sell. Daniel offered twice to buy it. She said no twice in the same gentle voice. She said the boat belonged to the boathouse, and the boathouse belonged to the cove, and the cove belonged to whoever was still alive to listen to it in the mornings. Once a month, on a Sunday, Daniel drove up from Portland with his 2 girls. They pulled the tarp off the boat together. He showed them how the chrome cleats were polished. He showed them how the cherry wood was waxed. He told them their grandfather had built it back up with his own hands, board by board, in a boathouse on a lake in Maine. He did not yet tell them the whole story. He told them he would when they were older. Margaret believed him. The letters Daniel kept in a cedar box on his nightstand. He read one each year on his mother's birthday. He never read more than that. He said the letters were a long, quiet conversation his father had been having with his mother across 40 years of silence, and he did not want to rush through the only voice of a man he had never met. The story made the local paper once, in a short item on the back page about a clerical error caught by a vigilant young bank manager. Nobody in Pinecrest pressed for more. The town had a long memory for kindnesses and a short memory for paperwork. The neighbors brought Margaret a casserole and a peach pie and a jar of honey from the bees up the road, and they did not ask her any questions she did not want to answer. Margaret lived in the cottage for 9 more summers. She watched 9 more loons raise 9 more chicks on the cove. She fixed the roof. She painted the porch swing twice. She left the boathouse door unlocked always. People in town thought that was strange. She told them that some things a man needed for himself, but a widow could afford to be open. On the morning she died in her sleep, in the bed she had shared with Walter for 41 years, the fog was on the cove and the loons were calling out toward the islands. Daniel found her. He had driven up to bring her a new kettle because the old one had finally given out the week before. He sat beside her for a long time before he called anyone. She was buried on the hill behind the white clapboard church, next to Walter, under the white pines. The stone she had chosen for herself read only, Margaret Holly's beloved. She had paid for the stone herself, in cash, the spring after the foreclosure went away. She had told the stonecutter no dates. She had told him no dashes. She had told him a woman who had spent 41 years between 2 dates did not need a third one carved in granite to prove she had been here. The stonecutter had been a young man. He had nodded the way young men nod when they do not understand but want to be kind. He had cut the stone exactly the way she had asked. Daniel kept the cottage. He kept the boathouse. He kept the boat under its tarp. On the first warm Sunday of every summer, he and his girls pried the door open with the same old crowbar Margaret had used, leaning in the corner behind the rakes where Walter had left it. The hinge still creaked. The dust still rose in the slats of light. The cove still hummed. And somewhere out past the islands, a single loon would always answer. The older girl had begun, last summer, to ask the kinds of careful questions that meant she was almost old enough to be told. Daniel had begun, last summer, to practice the answers in his head on the long drive up from Portland. He drove a little slower these days. He played the radio a little lower. He kept Margaret's old crowbar in the trunk, wrapped in a clean cloth, the way another man might have kept a Bible.